Well, thank you very much indeed. I have 10 minutes to do something impossible, so it's going to be interesting to work through. What I've been asked to do is to look at the implications for the 2030-35 proposals from the government to look at retail, on the retail distribution side of the automotive industry. As has been said, I'm professor at the Centre for Automotive Management at Loughborough. My claim to fame is I launched the world's first degrees in retail automotive management, and we have offered those degrees both across all the franchises, but also into the Middle East and the Far East, both online and also face-to-face. Just recently, I became president of the Institute of the Motor Industry. So what I wanted to do was just very briefly try and capture something which is sort of really a bit of a challenge. If you look at what's currently happening in the views within the motor industry, the automotive management are currently running a survey talking about 2030 and 35. And at the moment, 64% of the people inhabiting the retail automotive space are saying that this particular target, what's being suggested for 2030, 35, won't be achieved. It's just too difficult. And I think part of that stems from a range of different factors. One of them is there's a sort of skepticism over government and strategy anyway. We've been through the Blair government saying that what we should be doing is driving diesel. Diesel is the future and that everything happens on that. Then all of a sudden there's the U-turn, and then the industry gets into a mess with Dieselgate and Volkswagen and all the issues that underpin that. So then we have another government coming along and saying, right, what we've got to do by 2030 is just have electric or hybrid until 2035. And yet the industry is going, well, okay, what do you actually mean by that? Are you talking about full hybrid, part hybrid, plug-in hybrid, self-charging hybrid? What is it actually you're talking about? And also then, what is the infrastructure that's going to be put into place? There's a big statement in that policy document talking about the development of an infrastructure. But a lot of the retailers are saying, well, in my area, I live in I operate in a relatively built up area with a lot of terraced housing. How is that infrastructure going to be put in place? Because by 2030, the new car sales in the UK are around about 2.3 million. If you're saying you're going to suddenly put 2.3 million cars, which are not ICE, internal combustion engine driven, then what is going to be the infrastructure that's going to have to be there in place? And will we have the capacity, electricity-wise, to actually charge those number of vehicles? So there's a big kind of question over that whole kind of process. And then you have the other developments that isn't this kind of trying to constrain what is being done, because obviously other countries are going to go down different routes. Japan will undoubtedly go far away from electric as possible and stick primarily to hydrogen. They're in a position where, as a country, they have no natural resources. And also they've discovered that having a nuclear power station on a major fault line around the Pacific presents a bit of a challenge, both environmentally, but also for the health and safety of their population. And so therefore they will go hydrogen, as will possibly South Korea. Other countries around the world will stick with the internal combustion engine. A lot of Africa wouldn't have doesn't have the capacity to keep the lights on in the hotels and the hospitals. So having charging points is going to be a bit of a strange one. And Aston Martin have come out and said that they will continue to build cars for the world market, which are based on the internal combustion engine. So there's a certain cynicism or questioning about what is actually being put in place and whether the infrastructure that is being promised will actually be delivered to actually affect this. And it's interesting with the hydrogen debate that Toyota, the Metropolitan Police in London have got a fleet of Toyota Mirai based on hydrogen, because that seems to work pretty well for fleet where you've got one position with hydrogen as a possibility and as a place where they can get refueled. Also, a lot of people are saying, this is actually a small part of a bigger picture. As was described by the previous speaker, there's a lot of the D2C starting to take place. Manufacturers are now becoming or seeing themselves as mobility companies, that they are looking and saying, we can control both the new car sale, but also the used car sale in 1 or 2 or 3 possible cycles of that use. and also will offer other mobility options, including subscription and all the other sort of possibilities. And therefore, a lot of the research has been done, which actually says, well, now, when you look in the UK, people don't buy cars. Most new cars are not bought. They're under either a PCP or PCH. They have a personal contract or a leasing arrangement that you have with a finance company. And therefore you hand the car back after 3 or 4 years with a certain number of mileage points on it. And so therefore you have the manufacturers becoming mobility companies and people not buying cars anyway, but leasing them. Therefore, will we move into a situation where people simply, the cars are no longer sold, but in fact are simply leased, hired, subscribed, and that changes the whole model in which we're kind of operating. Because then, electric cars and subscription and how that works, who's responsible for charging a zip car, making sure that it's fired up before you can actually leave and all this sort of thing. There's a whole range of issues that underpin that. And so therefore we're looking very much at a move possibly to agency agreements, no longer franchised areas, but agency agreements whereby the dealerships and the retail network simply become click and collect for the manufacturers who will have the major in connection with the customer. And that really leads on to this whole issue about who owns the customer, who's in fact the person who actually has the major connection with the customer. Is it the manufacturer? Is it the dealer? And therefore, who owns the data? And it was interesting, the discussion that was started in the previous speaker concerning data and how that data is shared. So who owns the customer, who owns the vehicle, and who actually, the key one with the the electric cars, is who owns the battery. For, obviously that's going to be a big issue about degradation of battery and the leasing of that, or whether it's a purchase of that. There was a big debate when that first came out with the Nissan Leaf and some of the Renault product about who actually was responsible for the battery. And there are, in the Renault network, some interesting examples where people have traded in their car, and it's now on the forecourt of a dealership, but in fact they're still having to pay for the battery because they're leasing the battery, and it's not until the car's sold that lease moves over to somebody else. A big challenge is going to be what type of technicians are available. We've got only a relatively small number of people who, under the Electricity at Work Act, who are actually trained up to work on these sort of vehicles. And therefore there's going to be a need, and there's an open letter come out from the Institute, which I'm president of, asking that this is going to be a major challenge going forward. There's also the issue about the accreditation and registration of technicians, because it was alluded to about the concept of the connected car, and therefore there's a big issue with that. With connected car, data is actually transferred between various bodies, and the question mark is who then is responsible for that data, and when is your data at its most vulnerable? Connected cars give opportunities for people to use vehicles in a very unpleasant way. I was speaking in New York to a number of technicians, and they were saying, look, we can stop a car remotely. You can put the automatic braking system on. You can do that remotely quite easily. And you then ask the question, well, okay, fine, you're traveling at 70 miles an hour down a motorway and somebody remotely is able to put the automatic braking system on. Everybody piles in the back. And what we had in the situation in New York, they were saying, how many cars would that need to happen to gridlock New York? And it came out to be 3. And the challenge is, when is your car is most vulnerable? And when actually it's being serviced? Because you're basically, it's a bit like handing your laptop over to a third party and saying, here's everything, here's my passwords and everything. And then the work is done on the car. And that can be a big issue. And so there's a big drive within the Institute of the Motor Industry for the accreditation of technicians to ensure that their backgrounds are checked so that the vehicle doesn't become a potential cybersecurity threat. So there's a whole range of things that are buzzing around within this area. And it's the lack of clarity at the moment as to what the government are actually intending with the 2030, 2035, and whether this will in fact constrain alternative fuel systems, alternative technologies from actually being developed by prescribing something in this particular way.